Oh dear. Well, 非常感谢你们来听我讲话. Thanks very much for coming. I need to be very grateful to many people. I'm in Holland, and my father came to Holland many years ago at the end of World War II. And so he always told me stories about ladies riding bicycles with hats with flowers on them. And that the boats went above the road, and I was keen to see it. Now I have a fellowship with the Netherlands Institute of Ecology, and I work with Common Land, and if I had to wear a Formula One suit over the last 21 years, many organizations have helped me on this journey. So I'm going to share with you a very personal journey. I started as a journalist covering stories like the rise of China from poverty and isolation, and the Tiananmen massacre, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's interesting because then I went to the Loess Plateau. And I found out that the natural ecology of the region and of the earth is more important than these geopolitical events. And the Loess Plateau is named for its soil geomorphology. It's a mineral soil. It's created by glacier movements high in the Himalayas, and then the sediments come down by wind. And so what's interesting is that this is also the cradle of Chinese civilization. So this is where the Han race emerges. And so if you dig about in there, you're probably going to strike history at some point. And he's not digging fast enough. There he goes. But in 1995, I was asked to go to this place by the World Bank. This is to the southwest of the Loess Plateau. It's a fully functional forested system. But in 1995, it looked like this. And I began to wonder, what is going on? I still have the same jacket, you see. But it was astonishing to me that the largest ethnic group on the planet could have come from a place that was this massively degraded. And, you know, I had dropped out of college to go be a television cameraman. But then I got so interested. Now it's been 20 years I've been studying consistently what happened here. And I found that this is the story of geological time, the story of evolutionary time, and the story of human history. It's not simply the story of the Chinese in the Loess Plateau. And what you see here are giant gullies. And these gullies show that there must be quite a lot of water, because how could you make these enormous gullies? But it's like a desert. And what we found was that the developmental trajectory here was very similar to the developmental trajectory in all the cradles of civilization. The people cut the trees. They did slope farming on the hillsides, and then they free-ranged goats and sheep until all the vegetation was gone. And this created a cycle of poverty and degradation. So the more they tried to extract from the system, the worse the ecology became. And they became desperately poor. This is now, at that time in China, it was a place where there were people who could not marry because they didn't have the ability to support a family. So they were terribly sad in this place. And it was sort of renowned. They called it China's sorrow. And as I looked at this, I became fascinated with it, and I wanted to know everything about this. And it started a long inquiry, which continues, so I can't seem to stop. Now I'm going to ask Jürgen Vogela, who is the head of agriculture of the World Bank, then was the project manager for the Loess Plateau Watershed Management Project, to tell you a little bit about this.
Now, when we came to this place in the Loess Plateau the first time, we were all really shocked. We thought, oh my God, well, how can ever anybody try to rehabilitate an area that is so huge and so fundamentally destroyed ecologically? And the truth is, we spent 2 years working with the local people, with the farmers, with the local officials, with the experts in the various fields of hydrology, soil and water conservation, forestry, agriculture, environment, try to understand what it would take to do something like this. And after 2 years, we still didn't have many answers. The World Bank didn't have the answer, and the local people didn't have the answer. And we spent another 1.5 years talking to the farmers in the villages, trying to understand what they had done in the past 20 or 30 years that was successful. And it was really interesting. Not much was there to show, because the current practices at that time were just not sustainable at all.
So the entire Loess Plateau is 640,000 square kilometers, approximately the size of France. But the project area that they were working on was 35,000 square kilometers, approximately the size of the Netherlands. And they used geographical information systems to map the entire region, and they gave individual addresses to every watershed. And they used participatory mechanisms to engage the public in understanding that the ecological function was completely destroyed. Because what you can see if you look at this is the biodiversity is gone, the biomass is gone, and the organic materials have gone. And this has become sort of the basis of the thesis that I follow, because we see that this massively alters gas exchange. It massively alters fertility, nutrient release from geologic materials, nutrient recycling, and massively alters hydrological regulation, the natural regulation of water, weather, and climate. And so it turns out, now when I started to do this, people thought I was crazy, but now they think I'm not so crazy, maybe. And it's become more and more obvious all over the world that we've got these huge areas, and all the problems that we have seem to be connected to this, to the loss of the ecological functioning. Now, if the story ended here, it would be a very sad story. Well, that's a very typical perspective. And what they did was they took these people who were living in Neolithic agricultural conditions, and they transitioned them in one generation. And in 2009, we made Hope in a Changing Climate. You've seen parts of this film in green gold. It was reworked by VPRO. And a massive change. was undertaken. And what they did was not a single intervention. They made a holistic, systemic intervention. They took the people and they engaged them in the inquiry. So what I've noticed is when you go someplace and you kind of say, well, I wonder how the moisture infiltrates into the ground, then all the people start to think about that. And they had these huge programs, but they had to convince the people how to do it, and they had one really great mechanism. They paid them. This worked really well. And so they essentially substituted new behaviors for the older unsustainable behaviors. And they did this, subsidizing it for 10 years. And at the end of the 10 years, then they had a whole new set of behaviors that had become habitual, and the old behaviors were distant memories. And they did water harvesting, they did soil creation, they did revegetation at scale, and they differentiated and designated ecological and economic land. This, I think, is extremely important. Instead of looking at all the land as economic and exploiting it, they said, well, there's no use at doing that because there's no productivity from these ruined areas. Let's release them. And by releasing them, they were able to get a really good result. So, from a sort of poverty-stricken, hopeless situation, they all got jobs. And then they all did the work, so they actually knew exactly what was necessary to make these systems functional.
The goal was to give a hat to the hilltops, give a belt to the hills, as well as shoes at the base. The hat meant that the top of these hills had to be replanted with trees. The belt meant that terraces had to be built, to be used for crop planting and also for trees. The shoes were the dams which we had to build, so that the hills could grow back to life, and our economy, as well as our lives, could improve.
When I first filmed Mr. Ta Fuyuan and his colleagues back in 1995, I had no idea this initiative could achieve such dramatic results. The effort that people put into converting their slopes into terraces has resulted in a marked increase in agricultural productivity. The higher yields are directly related to the return of natural vegetation in the surrounding ecological land. So, what I've seen is that it's possible to rehabilitate large-scale damaged ecosystems, including ecosystems that have been degraded over long historical time frames. And that it's possible to rehydrate dehydrated biomes. It's possible to encourage the return of biodiversity in places where it's been lost. And in many cases, you have dormant seeds, dormant potential. And I wondered, is China unique? Is it because China is an autocratic, authoritarian country and everybody will listen to what the government says? Is it possible to do this in other parts of the world. And I was given a fellowship. So from being a college dropout, I started getting fellowships, and I got one from the Rothamsted Research Institute. It turns out this is the oldest soil and agriculture institute in the world now. And they started working at the time of Darwin and Malthus, and they invented artificial fertilizers and pesticides. So I think they have some karma. But in 2006, when I got this appointment, I didn't know what it meant. But as soon as I got this, the director said, "You must go to Africa." And then the Global Environment Facility, the British Development Agency, and the World Bank said, "Go to Africa." So I went to Rwanda, Tanzania, Ethiopia, and South Africa. And in Rwanda, we had an extraordinary outcome. And I think you're going to see young John. Many things that I've seen in Rwanda remind me of some of the things that I've seen in China. The Chinese government was asking this generation and all the generations alive today to change the course of human history, to take the denuded landscape that they had and somehow alter this. Now, this is a letter saying, "Thank you for coming and sharing this." That's very nice. But then they sent me another letter, and this says that they're going to rewrite their land use policy laws and link their economic development with ecology. And now it's 8 years later, and there's data. So there's 8 years of data. What happens if you link your economic development with ecological function?
Maybe 3 years of growth, so that by 2020 we have 30% of actually forested area. So there's now did an aggressive campaign across the country to restore destroyed forests.
There has been a lot of restoration that has been carried out relating to our environment. And we've seen that restoration grow from year to another year.
We have a target of increasing our electricity generation. Today we are at about 97 megawatts, and we want to increase that to 1,000 megawatts in the next 8 years. And we are targeting that about 80% or so of that source of energy should be renewable energy, mainly from hydropower electricity and from geothermal. So from 2014, we want to be producing any electricity from fossil fuels.
Because as individual smallholders, they have no hope of accessing markets at all. So we took up the policy of land conservation to ensure that. And we've been successful at that. We started it 4 years ago, and we as Rwanda now, today we are very proud to say we are food secure.
We've been growing at an average of 8.2%. And we've seen more than 1 million people of population lifted out of poverty in the last 5 years. That's 12% of our population. And we've achieved this within this mode of growth that caters for environment as well.
So, this has made me very philosophical. Because it seems like you can go and make observations and they lead to an understanding. And when that understanding is processed, it becomes consciousness. And a good friend of mine you're going to meet soon has told me that the state of the landscape of the earth reflects the consciousness of human beings. And I've now been all over the world looking at this, and I can't find any place that couldn't benefit from ecological restoration. That it's made me consider ecological function and dysfunction. And I found that there's really only these two states. So you're either degrading the ecosystem, or you're in some sort of equilibrium or supporting this. And what I've seen is that over evolutionary or geologic time, the Earth was a molten rock surrounded by poisonous gases. We couldn't breathe. And then the whole Earth was transformed by life into a magnificent garden. And whether you look at it from a religious cosmology, so our religious cosmologies say this, we're in the Garden of Eden. And if you look at it from evolution, over vast periods of time, the Earth was processed, and the atmosphere, the lithosphere, was transformed into the pedosphere. We have organic living soils. We have microclimates below the canopy. We have huge amounts of organic matter in the natural systems. But when you go to the human systems, no infiltration of water, no organic materials, toxic substances. It's completely different. This is the basis of the atmosphere, the hydrological cycle, the natural regulation of weather and climate. It must be paid. Attention must be paid to these things. And it's magnificent. We must live in awe of this. We live in paradise. And in the stories, in the cosmologies, we sinned. And we were expelled from the garden. And if that's not literal, but a poetic metaphor, I think I know what original sin is. I think it's the reduction of biodiversity, which then leads to the reduction in biomass, which then leads to the reduction in the accumulation of organic materials. Because this alters gas exchange, nutrient recycling, nutrient release, and massively alters infiltration and retention of rainfall. That's just cheating. It's a cheetah nursing in the wild. Sorry. But we have to understand this. We live in paradise. Why would we degrade this? Why would we say, and why are we doing this? Why does this happen? Is it necessary for this to happen? And what I've started to see is that, no, it's completely unnecessary. It's happening for a reason. It's happening because we don't value the natural systems. We value the derivatives. We value the things which we extract and manufacture and buy and sell. And we say that those things are more important and more valuable than these natural systems. Well, I can tell you it's not true. These systems are more valuable. And so our economic system has a major flaw. It values the derivatives higher than the source of life. And this is a philosophical mistake. And if you were to change this, some really amazing things would happen. If our money were to represent ecological function, all human efforts would go to protecting and conserving the natural systems or restoring them if they've been degraded. I think this is the next level of human consciousness, of human evolution. When we have this collectively and we understand this, we're going to move to the next phase of our time, which I call the great work of our time. So we're now facing global problems. The climate is changing. Biodiversity is being lost. It's outrageous. But we know very simple methods. This is simply putting straw, organic material, straw, into the sand. And then whatever rainfall, 25 millimeters, 50 millimeters, 100 millimeters, doesn't matter, will infiltrate. Bacteria will grow. Seeds will blow up. Birds will land there. And you will revegetate these areas. It's labor intensive. It's a little bit capital intensive. But we can do this. And we need to do this because this sequesters carbon. This re-regulates the hydrological cycle. There are millions of people without jobs. This is organic compost. This is Demeter biodynamic compost. This is the highest level of organics known. Since 1924, no chemicals. Their organic percentages are vastly higher. I just heard Professor Ratan Lal from Ohio State say that if we increased soil carbon by 2% around the world, it would offset all of our emissions. This is Rene Haller. He takes completely ruined landscapes and turns them into the Garden of Eden. This is tree plantations. I showed these pictures in Africa, and they said, no, that's a forest. And I said, no, this is a tree plantation. And, I mean, the Chinese are transplanting enormous trees now, so they can actually jumpstart an ecosystem with an older tree. But all over the world, there are these techniques. There are more, and we can, if we add renewable energies, and we add super insulation and passive solar technologies, we'll have sustainable lifestyles. But I think the key to this is valuing the natural systems. And if we value the natural systems, we have to say they're more valuable than the products, which end up on the trash heap and oozing toxicity into our soils. We're filters. We're drinking water. We're eating food. Everything. We're breathing air. Any pollutant that is released into the earth, we're going to filter. We are bivalves. So this, I think, is the great work of our time, and I'm going to ask a good friend of mine. So I'm in Holland because of Willem Verweerde. We met in Sweden in 2009, and he said, we must work together for the rest of our lives. And so I said, okay. And he's working on something to institutionalize restoration, to make it the way forward. A restoration industry. I think that must be him running. I hope he's in place. But all over the world we can do this.
I only know that we have to work fast to get a model ready for companies, investors, and states, governments, to restore landscapes. So what I propose is that we go to a system where we have 4 returns per hectare, and that a financial return or an investment return is a logical thing, but there are other 3 returns: the return of natural capital, or the return of nature, you could say here, the return of jobs, very important, because we are talking about people who want to work or need work and want to live well. But maybe the most important is return of inspirational capital or return of inspiration. If you bring the return of inspiration back in the landscape, it will also bring back a return of meaningfulness in people themselves.
Thank you. That's me.
Okay, good. Thank you, John. Before you leave the stage...
I'm still here.
You're still here, exactly. We don't have very much time for questions from the audience. Are you around for questions?
Yes.
Can grab your jacket and ask the questions.
Yes, please.
Please do, ladies and gentlemen.
Challenge me.
I got one challenge for you.
Okay.
I see lots of examples of people who have lost everything and start again and build an ecologically friendly new environment. So many people in your videos started from nothing and started to build something new. Here in the Netherlands, in Europe, there's not exactly a situation that we have nothing. However, many entrepreneurs, many organizations are in difficulties. How can you organize things so in a way that even if it feels like everything is lost, you can still make a new start with this new sort of thinking? What does it take? What sort of mindset, what sort of approach? How can we break through that?
Well, I think the thing that your question brings to my mind is to realize that we live on the earth and that we have global problems now, and we're going to have to address them as a species on a planetary scale. And what's interesting about what's happening in Holland, for instance, in Holland I see the technologies for water management. I see the technologies for soil creation, and I see the technologies for propagation. These are the technologies which are needed, but they're needed on a planetary scale. We have to stop thinking that we're Chinese or we're Americans or we're Dutch. We're human beings. We're all related to each other. We're all Africans, actually. And it's really necessary for us to have this perspective and reach a collective consciousness now. We will not solve our problems if we are separated in this way. We must come together in order to address them. The people who are in dire straits at the edges of degraded ecosystems are not there by accident. They're there because their societies were disrupted by colonization, by slavery, by historical crimes. And for them to pull themselves up by the bootstraps now is really probably not on. They've had generations of malnutrition. They haven't had education. They haven't had the Industrial Revolution practically. In some cases, they're living in Neolithic conditions. We have to have the ability to realize, and you know, in America they say something, they say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all human beings are created equal. I'm paraphrasing a little bit because he only said men, but we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all human beings are created equal. Now, I think we can embrace that philosophically, but we're going to have to do that in practice. And by valuing ecological function higher than products, we'll change the global economy. We'll make it possible to rebalance those things which are wrong. And those people who are disenfranchised and have been disenfranchised for hundreds of years, they'll be empowered. I think that's the way forward.
Okay, thank you. John D. Liu, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Okay.
Vind ik mooi, zo'n verhaal. De man die ik nu mag aankondigen is iemand waar John heel nauw mee samenwerkt. En ik heb ze net met z'n tweeën ontmoet. Het is een Nederlandse spreker die we nu krijgen. En je zag meteen dat die kerels vrienden zijn. En wat mij opviel, dat ze eigenlijk tegenpolen zijn. Dat zeggen ze ook, hè. Ze houden zich totaal andere dingen bezig. Maar op waarden hebben ze elkaar gevonden. Op de gemeenschappelijke doelen en waarden die je nodig hebt om die wereld een beetje beter te maken, hebben ze elkaar gevonden. Voor mij starten we eerst een kort filmpje in. En dan wil ik graag uw aandacht, dames en heren, voor Willem Verwerda. Dank u wel.